Yeah, if I wanted to, but I don't want to. I mean, I guess that's what it comes down to. Like, I don't want to do that.
There's enough.
There's a lot of, and I also don't think, I think that there's like an impetus maybe from like the New York publishing scene to where if you do publish that book, you may get some sort of acclaim, and if you do write that book, you're going to have a certain amount of readers. But I mean, I think a great thing about writing is that you have the opportunity to do what you want to do. So I'm really only interested in doing what I want to do insofar as I'm interested in writing fiction. And right now there seems to be interest in an audience for the things that I want to do. So I'll keep doing it until that's no longer the case.
Yeah, very nice. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And our last author on the panel, Jon Michael Varese. Let's see, where's yours? Hang on. There he is. So Jon is a historical novelist and scholar of 19th century literature. He is currently the director of public outreach for the Dickens Project, a multi-campus research consortium at the University of California. His edition of Dickens' Great Expectations was published under the signature imprint of Barnes and Noble in 2012. His debut novel, The Spirit Photographer, takes place in Boston and New Orleans, and it arose out of his work in American history and the Reconstruction period. Jon was born in Miami, and he spent most of his childhood reading books under his grandmother's mango tree. He lives in the
Someone's been
Hudson
reading my
Valley now.
website.
Is that true?
So, yes.
The Times Literary Supplement says of this book, there is not a dud word in this extraordinary debut novel by Jon Michael Varese. And Booklist gave it a starred review saying, it's an entertaining amalgam of history, fiction, gothic, and ghost story. The Spirit Photographer is an addicting tale. Jon, can you tell us about it?
Sure. So the novel is about a man who claims he can photograph ghosts. And it is based on a real phenomenon that happened in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, that began in the 1860s during the Civil War here in the United States, based on a figure named William Mumler, who was doing this very thing. He had basically accidentally discovered the process of double exposure at a very early time in photography when no one knew when that was, and when photographs were done on wet plate glass collodion photographs. If people know Mathew Brady's photographs, the famous Civil War photographer Mathew Brady, these are wet plate glass collodion photographs, very sharp, done on glass. You can actually if you don't like the picture, you can actually take all the silver off the glass and reuse the glass. And it's thought that that Mumler, the real spirit photographer, that he accidentally didn't clean a glass plate very well and took a photograph of another person, and the person he had photographed prior to that was still on the glass, and so that person came through as a hazy image. And he didn't claim it as a spirit photograph initially, but this was during the Spiritualist movement, and a Spiritualist saw this because he had it up in a sort of a public place and said, "Ah, Mr. Mumler, you photographed a ghost," and he said, "Yes, I did," and actually built a very lucrative business out of it. So this was just a fascinating premise to start a novel on. By training, I'm a Victorianist in 19th century British literature. I've not worked in American history too much, but it's always been my love, and it's always sort of shadowed me in my work on Great Britain. And so I started writing this book, and originally it did not have, it was historical, but the main characters were Edward Moody, the photographer, and I had this idea about, he would photograph someone, and he'd be making all this money on these phony photographs, but one day he would take a picture, and a figure would emerge in the picture that he didn't put in there. And so he would be at a loss to explain who this was. And that would start the story. And that is, in fact, the story. But as I was researching more and more into this phenomenon and dealing with America in the mid-19th century, I just said this in the last panel, too, because I was asked about it. the issue of slavery just kept cropping up. I was astounded at how ubiquitous the issue of slavery was in United States history. And I was astounded because, I mean, I just felt really almost embarrassed that as an American, I had not absorbed that fact, you know, through all my study of history. So the story began to take shape in another way, and there is the people who are photographed in this photograph that sets the story off are a very prominent senator, the most prominent of the radical Republican senators in Boston, based on Charles Sumner of Boston and his wife. And they are going to get a photograph of their dead kid who died 18 years or so ago. And instead of their child in the picture, which the photographer has staged, an African-American woman appears in the picture. And both Moody, his assistant, Joseph Winter, who's a veteran of the Black Cavalry in Massachusetts, this is taking place in 1870, so right after the Civil War, the senator and his wife all have connections to this woman who appear in the photograph. And as they're looking at it and it's developing, they all see her emerge on the negative, and they all recognize her. But none of them knows that the other ones have connections to her. So they all see it and think, she's popping up on this picture and she's appearing to them. And so the book is essentially the unraveling of who she is, and what she means to all of them. The big thing that wound up happening with the book over the 6 years that I was writing it, and as George said, half of it takes place in New Orleans, and I spent many research trips here working on the book. That whole issue of slavery in American history and our development as a nation became more and more prominent, and I just couldn't get away from it. I actually tried to get away from it, and I couldn't get away from it because I thought, I'm not writing a book about slavery. I'm trying to write this ghost story. Go away, slavery. But slavery would not go away, and indeed it still hasn't gone away. And it's really emblemified for me right a couple blocks from here. There's a scene in the book that takes place in the old St. Louis Hotel, which is the current Omni Hotel, corner of St. Louis and Charters, which is the back of the hotel. There is still the residue on the wall of the old exchange, which was an exchange for cattle and sugar and property deeds and slaves. And it was one of the most prominent in the city. And that corner here in New Orleans it symbolizes for me so much of what is still wrong in the country. Because you have sort of all these people celebrating, there are restaurants on the corners, everyone's drinking, and people just sort of turn a blind eye to this thing that's there, and it's the words. I encourage everyone to go by and look at this. The words are there like a ghost on the wall. And it's there, and it's not going away. So that was really the energy that infused the book during the sort of last 3/4 of its writing. And I finally got validation around that just a couple weeks ago because someone gave me a 1-star review on Goodreads. And they said, I thought this was going to be a ghost story. It's a book about slavery. and they gave it this 1 star. So I thought, it's bittersweet, but like I felt like that the story came through for this person, and it was actually very validating.
Don't read your reviews on Goodreads.
I don't normally.
Don't do it.
John, in reading your book, I really saw your background as a Dickens scholar and in American history, and I was just so impressed with your plotting and the scope of the novel.
Thank you.
Because it ranges all over, from Boston to swamps outside of New Orleans. And you told me that it's very unlike previous novels that you had written, and I just wondered how you jumped into it, or how you managed that kind of plotting and that complexity.
Well, the reason for the plotting, I think we talked about the other day. I had been working on sort of a family memoir
Right.
in the vein of Marilyn Robinson's Housekeeping, which is one of my all-time favorite books. But that book was written in the 80s, published I think in the early 80s, a different time. It reads like a memoir. It's not a memoir. It's a novel. I mean, a lot of people read it and think it's actually a memoir, and it's not at all. But I love that book, but it has this, famously has no plot. If any, if it has a little bit, but there's sort of no plot. And so I had written my family memoir that way, just a sort of a chronological plotting through little boy grows up with 4 aunts, and there just wasn't much of a plot to it. It was just much more experiential. And my agent basically submitted that to places for 10 years, and for 10 years I heard that I had no plot. And that was what pretty much every rejection letter said over the many years. And I would sort of rewrite it, and I would put like maybe a little bit more plot, and then he would send it out 3 more times, and they would say it has no plot. So I said to him one day, why don't I try to write something with a plot, and let's see what happens. And so I plotted this out, and that's why it's so plot driven.
But it's amazing. I mean, it's fascinating, the territory that this novel covers. I mean, it's gripping. It's great.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'd like to try to have some conversations now with all of us. These novels, as I said, they're so different, and they represent 4 very different genres. But I'm wondering if we can tease out some common experiences you had in writing them, maybe, or in maybe your path to publication. Can we use that as a starting point? If these are your first published books, how did that happen for you? And will we find any similarities there or not? Anyone want to jump in on that?
I had to go first the first time. So.
I can go.
Sure.
This book
How it came to be published, basically.
Yeah, it took about 6 years to write, 5 to 6 years to write, and then my agent started submitting it. But it's my first published novel. It's not my first published book because I have academic publications, but it's my first published novel. I've had my agent for 20 years. There are 3 novels before this one that obviously didn't work for whatever reason, or at least didn't work for the current markets, whatever they were. But this novel, The Spirit Photographer, had 37 rejections.
Good Lord.
Before Chelsea Cutchins at Overlook and Peter Mayer at Overlook decided to take a chance on me. And the process is a slog. I mean, it's just a slog of. They're all going to concur everything I'm saying. I think it's just a process of submitting over and over again and finding that needle in the haystack of an editor who is going to believe in you and believe in your work. And I mean, I've even had situations at publishing houses where, or know of situations in publishing houses where there can be 2 editors at the same publishing house, and one would reject the work, but one may actually accept it. So the publishing house doesn't act as this unified body by any means. There's all sorts of divisions in publishing houses, and there are political divisions in publishing houses, and editors have to go to the table to fight for the books that they want to publish, because there's always more coming in than is going out. So in terms of how this particular book got to publication, that's how it got to publication, just over and over and over submissions. And a lot of it, there's been a lot of panels here this weekend that have brought up the idea of luck and what sort of role luck plays in your role as an author, and pretty much everyone concurs that it plays an enormous role. If you send the book in on a Tuesday, it might get accepted, and if you send it in on a Thursday, it might get rejected.
So you're saying if you're sitting in books, send them in on Tuesday?
I'm saying you have a better chance of just sort of like throwing a dart at a dartboard and seeing where it hits to choose your. And the important thing to take out of all this, though, George, is that you can't take any of it personally. You can't take any of it personally.
I want to come back to that about your comment earlier about the rose-colored glasses. I remember that.
Yeah.
We'll talk
So,
about that in a
bullets.
minute. Bryan Washington, I'm curious about your collection because you've had a great reception for this. I mean, it seems that it's really struck a spark with a lot of people. And I'm wondering if that was always a given for you or how easy was it to sell? And did you expect the reception that you're getting on it now?
No. No. You asked 3 questions. No. So no. I would just agree with your earlier statement about not taking things for granted, and also not taking things personally. My agent and I, what we really did is just made a list of houses that would be amenable to story collections, or particularly to American literary fiction story collections. And we had reaches, and then we had folks that we thought, might be interested in it, and then we had another page for folks that we would submit to in the next iteration. We submitted to 5 folks first, and all 5 of them, they said nice stuff, but no was like the bottom, at the very bottom of the thing. 2 of them said, if it were a novel, we would maybe possibly take it. And the other.
Excuse me, George, Bryan, had
Yeah.
you already published some of the stories in big
Yeah,
magazines?
well, I published 1 or 2 in fairly big magazines, yeah. But although I think this is changing, people are doing really cool stuff with story collections now. A lot of my peers and friends, they're publishing actively, and their story collections are getting a lot of reception. But they've been published in a few different places. I think what happened for the most part for me was I was very fortunate that my current editor, before she went on maternity leave, she got a copy of the manuscript. Laura Perciasepi at Riverhead. She's just the best. Like, I work with really great people, and she was super receptive to it. And then she sent a copy of the manuscript to her co-editor, or not co-editor, but somebody else within the house, an editor named Becky who was from Houston, and she sort of co-signed her endorsement. So I was really fortunate in that regard to fall into Riverhead was like my number 1 choice. So the fact that those things would line up is a thing that will probably never happen again. Like, it's just not a thing that you can sort of count on. What's really interesting, I think, is that the book has gotten whatever reception that it's gotten, right, and people seem to be here for it for the most part. But the effect that has had on selling the next thing has been super interesting, because we sold it 3 weeks ago, but to Riverhead, like same publisher. But even with that was never a sort of assured thing, right? So there's always going to be this sort of ambiguity as to whether an editor or whether a house will still be behind the work that you put forward. Especially now that everyone's sort of holding on to the money that they have. There's not a whole lot of money in American literary fiction unless you're writing. Unless you're like someone whose name you could throw out and everybody knows. But it's a very, there's just a lot of luck that goes into all of it.
Can I ask, when you were writing and publishing stories, did you already have it in mind that they were connected and that they might form a collection? And how many stories in here were already published? And then how many did you have to add? And how did you shape those stories into a collection? Was that always in your mind?
No, I think that at some point I looked up and I said, shit, I'll have 6 stories. Maybe I have a collection, that sort of thing. So it wasn't a very...
But the stories all had the similar setting.
They do, and that speaks to, I think, my editor and her vision, and I think that speaks to my agent and her vision as far as deciding like what a cohesive project would look like, right? Because when we originally published the individual stories, let's say like 5 were originally published, and there are like 11 in the book. Those were singular entities, and like they were just autonomous of each other. But when we were trying to make a book, we didn't just want a bunch of stories that were independent of one another. We wanted a book, like a cohesive whole. So I would give much of that credit to a mentor at UNO, actually, Joanna Leake, if anybody knows who Joanna is. Like, she's awesome, yeah. She was one of the first people who said, hey, maybe you could possibly do something here. And so that sort of thing is like really important, yeah. But also my agent and my editor, when we were editing the book and just sort of working to make it a cohesive whole, I think that was really really when it became more of a book than just sort of a bunch of stories that Bryan wrote.
Did you change some of the stories then to make it fit into the collection?
Some were changed very much, and then some weren't changed very much at
You
all.
changed names of characters so the names would repeat from story to story?
Here and there. I mean, when I was publishing them in literary journals, I mean, every literary journal has a sort of house style, right? So there are certain things for each literary journal that might not work for another literary journal. Like, for example, like the New Yorker story, I guess you mentioned. In the book, it's like fucking like 15,000 words, yeah? But the New Yorker wasn't going to publish a 15,000 word story. So we ended up cutting about 3,000 words. And the iteration that's in the New Yorker is about 12,000 words. So in order to make that work, we had to, take out certain scenes, condense certain scenes, expand other parts so that it worked as a whole without the context of the rest of the book around it. So the difference, I suppose, between a lot of the stories as they existed in literary journals and as they existed in the book can be pretty profound. I guess if you like printed it out and you looked at both of them. But when we were editing the book, we wanted the book to exist on its own, right? I didn't want someone to have happened to have read the fucking like winter issue of Tin House in order to see what sense the story made in the book. Like I wanted like readability and approachability for a text is really important to me. I like when people can just pick up a book and read it and know what's going on. So editing the stories in such a way that they were all approachable and someone could just know what was happening was really important to me.
Yeah, that's terrific. Yeah.
All right,
Somebody
I guess
else on publishing?
I could step up. So this book took me a while to write. I think it was between 5 and 7 years. I can't remember because I also had 2 babies while I was writing them. So it's pretty intense to write through morning sickness and nursing and all of that. So that definitely spread the process out. But I didn't sell this until I think I was 39. And I had wanted to be a writer since I was maybe 8. So there was a long period there of development in which, because I loved all of these old books, I kept trying to write like them. And I remember one teacher told me the most cutting but resonant comment I ever received was, "You can't write a 17th century novel in the 20th century. This was the 20th century." And I was like, oh. And then that started a process of really being able to sort of think about my voice and my perspective, and to kind of, I needed to write this book to kind of liberate myself from this heritage that I had absorbed almost without thinking. So maybe this book took me 25 years to write in reality. But the process of moving from writing to publishing, yeah, is pretty agonizing. If that was what you were sort of saying, I will concur wholeheartedly. For me, it was really the process of getting an agent, of submitting to so many agents. And agents, it's like internet dating or something. You send this book and this agent says, "Oh my God, I love it. Don't talk to any other agents. Let me finish it. I'm getting back to you this week." And then they get back to you and say no. And so you're in this constant frame of just like the rejection and the confusion. And so I kept, there were so many close calls. I must have a really magnetic first chapter because everybody would start it and be like, yes, and then change their mind. And this problem was solved by the time we put it on submission to publishing houses because that process was much easier and much quicker. So I think whatever edits my agent had me do with it must have really been smart because we sold it pretty quickly once it went out on submission to the publishing houses. But the period of looking for agents was about a year of the worst internet dates that I could ever imagine. By the end of it, I was just a mess because it's very hard to put yourself out there in that way and just constantly not be chosen. So the aspect of perseverance really comes in, I think, in that process where you just realize that you're just going to keep doing it until something happens. And if you do long enough, sometimes, again, if luck comes into it, then all of a sudden you find yourself on the other side of that hill, which is momentous. And then there's a whole other slew of things that happen when you first publish a book and sort of experience the business aspect of this thing that's always been your sort of private passion, and what marketing people bring to it, and what, it's like a whole other world for the people who are in charge of selling your book. So that then becomes its own new process that you have to accommodate yourself to, and brings up a lot of other new feelings. But there is just something absolutely amazing about being able to see this object on this table that's my book that other people could pick up now. And so that makes the whole process just so unquestionably worth it.
Iris, was this your first and only novel that you've written?
I mean, I've got 3 in a drawer that will
Okay,
never
that's what
be
I wanted to hear.
published. Oh
That's
my
what I wanted
gosh,
to hear,
yeah.
yeah.
No, I decided to rewrite Crime and Punishment. Like, that's the kind of thing that I was doing, and everybody was like, no thank you, we'll pass on that. And then I was like, okay, let's look at myself and my experience with like a new kind of honesty and a harsher eye, and think about what I really need to write about. Which I think that process of learning what it is that you really need to write about is something that Bryan was kind of speaking to as well. Is you need to figure out what are those stories that you really need to tell, even if they are slightly different from the stories that you've absorbed throughout your life and admired.
Yeah, one thing that I'll just like add to that, I mean, I feel like there's a big difference, at least on my end, between being rejected by an agent or a publisher for something that I actively wanted to write and being rejected for something that I sort of half-assed, or like a narrative that I thought would sell and it didn't happen to sell.
Yeah, one rips your heart out with a spoon, and the other one you're like, yeah, that's
like,
probably right. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, I'll say it's probably no surprise, but you and I have very different internet dating experiences. I never got the yes, don't talk to anybody else. I just got no thanks. So I started this, like I said, the very first scene, the very first draft, evacuating for Katrina. Came back relatively quickly after Katrina because I was going to school at Southeastern, so Hammond was much easier to get to, and so finished undergrad. I think that was my last of. We're not going to talk about how many years of undergrad, or the second to last year. And so over the next year, I wrote a draft of this book, and so then it was great, right? I'm Stephen King now. I wrote a book. Now things just happen, and that turned out not to be the case. And so the kind of prevailing wisdom, I don't know if this is true in the other genres, but the prevailing wisdom in speculative fiction is you publish a lot of short stories, you get your name out there, and then agents will be interested in whatever crappy book you're trying to sell. And so I submitted some short stories. I submitted my very first badly written query letters to agents, just resounding no's. And then I got into the low residency program at UNO. And so wrote a lot of short stories there, and then did the thing that you're really not supposed to do, but wrote a novel for my thesis instead of taking some of the short stories that I had written and fixing them up and making a collection. I rewrote this novel, so that's rewrite that's version number 2. Wrote a draft of it, and unlike a lot of MFA graduates, I went from the end of my coursework to finished thesis by the end of that year, because I had a wife who told me that I needed a job. And so there was no like, I'll just take a year and figure out how I'm gonna put this thesis together. She was like, no, you're done with schoolwork, turn in your thesis. So I had 30 pages when I was finished with, and this was a full rewrite. So I had 30 pages when I was finished with my last semester. It was low residency, so we went abroad. So my last semester in Mexico. So that was a summer semester, and then by October I had a draft of the novel. Anything that I've accomplished in my life, by the way, is because of my wife standing over me going, "Are you done yet? Are you done yet?" Which will come into play in just a little bit. So I finished. I wrote a novel, and then I rewrote a novel. So now I'm Stephen King, right? And one of my thesis advisors was kind enough to put me in touch with their agent. Their agent sent me to another agent. That agent asked if I thought about writing it as a YA novel. So then I was on my own again, submitting to other agents, and once again, just a resounding set of no's, on and on for a few years. And then I got into Clarion West, once again, because my wife told me, apply to this thing, stupid. And so I got into Clarion West.
It's a writing workshop.
Right, it's a writing workshop that is it's a juried workshop. entry. They only take 18 students a year, and the instructors are professionals in the speculative fiction field. Kelly Link taught my year. George R. R. Martin, Chuck Palahniuk, who wrote Fight Club. I've had margaritas with George R. R. Martin. It was pretty cool. So I went to that workshop and wrote some short stories there. And then when I went home, I had a lot of thought about my writing process and my writing style, and some voices in my head about how writing should work, especially speculative fiction. So we're on the 3 now. I rewrote the novel again and started sending it out. And sending it out over and over and over to different agents. And at this point, I had read some books about how to write query letters. So at that point, I started getting, yes, send me the first 50 pages. Yes, send me the whole book. And so now I was starting to feel like, okay, now I'm Stephen King. And then I got to, let me see the whole book. No, thank you, there are problems. And that went on for quite a few years, to the point where I finally decided, look, maybe this book isn't going to do anything. Which, most people figure out like 10 years into the or 10 years before I did. So I moved on to something else, and I kept in touch with a lot of my Clarion West classmates, and one of them had finished a novel and was sending it out to, or wanting to send out query letters. And so I said, here's an example of a query letter that nobody bought the book, but nobody wanted to be my agent, but they at least wanted to read the book after reading the letter. And one of the administrators in Clarion West said, that sounds like an interesting book. Can I read it? And I was like, you're literally the only one person who wants to read this book, so sure. So she read it and really liked it and put me in touch with an agent who read it and said, here's a list of the problems that I think you need to fix. And I was like, okay, this is it. This is my moment. This is, don't screw this up. So I went through that list and I changed as little as possible. I changed those specific things that he had pointed out. That took me a couple of months, and I sent it back to him. And he said, look, he got that back to me relatively quickly for an agent, about a month. And he said, look, I see that you changed the things that I said, but it looks like you changed as little as possible. You have some pretty significant issues, right? The first half of the book is really slow. And so for instance, the main character, on page 1, he's a demigod. In every other draft of the book, but the last one, that was like a mid-book reveal, like dun dun dun, he's really a part god. So I moved some stuff all the way to the front of the novel and changed again, so a whole nother rewrite. I vanished from my agent he wasn't my agent, right? He never signed with me at that point. He just said, if you want to take another shot at it, I'll take a look at it. And then I vanished for a year. And a year later, I came back. I was like, I don't know if that offer is still good, but I wrote the book again. Here, take a look at it. And then he made me cut an entire character out over the Labor Day weekend. He didn't make it Labor Day weekend, but I was like, I only have 3 days before I have schoolwork and stuff that I have to do, so nobody talked to me, and I took an entire character out of the novel in 3 days. And then send it back to him. And I distinctly remember, you talk about like the slog and the long process. My students were taking a vocabulary quiz, and I checked my email. And there was an email from my agent who said, I think we're ready to go on submission. We just have to talk about the title. And I mean, I had written 4 different versions of the book with different titles every time. And I was like, every other step of this process has been over and over and over again, things are going to change. If by some miracle, some editor buys the book, they're going to want to change the title. So I looked at the list of things that he and his assistant and I had said, and I was like, City of Lost Fortunes, that looks good, go with it. And then I got an email back, and he was like, okay, we're on submission. I was like, whoa, what happened to the slog? What happened to... and so he sent it out to a handful of people, and from starting to write the book in Bev's class to that moment was about 11 years, and we sold the book in a week. So,
Yeah.
which
Good
doesn't
for you.
happen.
So I want to toss out one more question before we open it up to questions from you guys. Maybe, how about this? Some of the best or worst advice that you ever received as as a pre-debut novelist or author, and or maybe also what advice you would give to somebody hoping to sit on a panel like this someday and to be a debut author? Best or worst advice that you received, and what advice you might give to aspiring authors?
My agent of 20 years once said to me, probably about 15 or 16 years ago, it was after however many number of rejections on one of the many projects, and I was really discouraged, as one feels through the entire process. And so I said to him, well, I'm a pretty adaptable writer. I could, what projects do you think I should work on, to sort of get something into the marketplace? Do you want me to give a go to write a romance novel or something like that? Because those always sell, right? And he said, and I was probably like 23, maybe 25, I don't know. And he said, and it sounds going to sound a little sentimental and cheesy, but it's really true. He said, you have to write what's in you to write. And those are just words that I have carried through with me for my entire career. And I really believe in them, because if you don't do that, the chances of it being good are lower than if you're just trying to write something to just sort of produce something on spec or.
But that's what sustains you through all the slog.
That's what I was about to say, is that this is, as you have just heard from all of us, this is such an onerous, discouraging, demoralizing process.
It is. It's a horrible
that
career.
If you're not working on something you really believe in and that you're really passionate about, like, that's going to be what sustains you through this process, not the promise of the pot of gold, because there really isn't one at the end. So
there's no pot of gold. You heard it here first.
Speaking to sort of what sustains you, I'm not sure if this was advice given to me specifically or just something I learned along the way, which is to make friends with other writers has been absolutely essential to me, because it's a mysterious process and an enormously demoralizing process. And just having other writers around to read your work, to give you feedback, because as you say, like, write what you have to write, but also let someone else read it and give you their opinions on it, because sometimes it's very hard to see for yourself what exactly you're trying to do and what are the problems with it. But then the process to publication, like you talked about figuring out query letters, if I hadn't had a circle of writer friends also starting out, also trying to figure out how to navigate all of this, I would have been absolutely lost. And you have no sense of perspective when you receive all of these rejections. Does that mean you shouldn't be a writer? And then you talk to 3 friends and they also second that and say, no, I also got 30 rejections or 40 rejections. And you realize that this is all part of the process. So having a group of people that you trust and that you can sort of navigate all of this oddness together has been absolutely just essential for me.
All of the bad advice that I've gotten has been masquerading as well-intentioned good advice, and it's almost always in the vein of, this is how I did it, so these are the footsteps you should follow in, right? And it makes sense for just about any other profession other than this one, like there's not really my father works in HVAC repair, there's an apprenticeship program. He could tell you, like, if I had gone into that the way he did, I could have done it almost exactly the same way he did, and I would have achieved the level of success that he has at this point, but with this, publish a bunch of short stories, and then like the New Yorker doesn't look at me, like I couldn't get stuff published in semi-pro magazines, much less get stuff published in the New Yorker, but it worked for the other Bryan at the table, but if he had necessarily tried to do it my way, even though it's the same time frame that we're necessarily working in, it wouldn't have worked the same way. And in terms of some of, like, kind of what y'all were saying, in terms of finding a community. The other aspect of it to remember is once you've found your community, you should stick with them. A friend of mine, Bill Laughlin, he writes some really great New Orleans mysteries that you should read if you haven't yet. But he told me before we knew each other from the MFA program, and he told me at one point, and it's kind of a cliche, but a rising tide lifts all boats, and so just in terms of like my experience, I wasn't trying to get published when I had that kind of weird turning point moment of luck that we all kind of need that introduced me to my agent. I was trying to help somebody else figure out how to write a query letter, and that was the moment that, and like you talk about the strategic kind of marketing or the networking stuff, that I don't see how that works, because I guess it's being from New Orleans, and all I know is the New Orleans hospitality, but once you've found that kind of community, you need to stick with them and not be looking for, okay, well, what's the better community down the road? Dance with the one that brung you is, I guess, the advice that I would give.
Bryan?
Yeah, I think there's like a kind of a through line between everything that everyone said. But so I would just say, like, be kind to people, or just be kind to the people around you, which is sort of a hokey and sentimental thing to say, like, on one level. But I think from a two-pronged thing, partly because like you just shouldn't be shitty to other people who are working in the same field as you, a field that like has no money whatsoever, irrespective of, like, you can be in the Times or whatever, but that's not going to add like a fucking $0 to your advance, like that's not going to pay rent. So it is like, so just be kind, because there's no money and people are just trying to do it. And partly maybe more on a more practical level, you literally never know where other people end up. So cultivating relationships with agents or editors, because there might be an editor that you submit something to at one place and they can't accept it or whatever, but then they end up at another publishing house or another journal or website or whatever, and all of a sudden they're in a position to accept the stuff that you did. If you sort of burn that bridge, that doesn't exist. Same thing for like agents, right? Like, let's say you're working with an agent and you're not simpatico with them, and your current project doesn't sell. Burning that bridge when they are in a position where they're more amenable to the work, or where they're in a better position to sell that work, that doesn't really help you. I mean, maybe for like the New Yorker thing, like I do stuff fairly regularly for them now, but the very first thing that I sent them that was in the magazine, like they'd already read before, right? I'd submitted it via Slush and they'd sent me a very nice no letter. And then I sent it to a lot of other journals and they all said no. But it just so happened that someone that I had developed like a non-professional relationship, just like bullshitting on Twitter with, had gotten an in at that magazine, and then they happened to see the story at the right time, and all of a sudden, just being nice to people, the story's in the magazine all of a sudden. But being shitty to someone, because they can't make something work out for you, all of a sudden that doesn't happen, right? So just sort of being kind to people in the field that you share, because I think that everyone, or most people that are in the field, have like the best of intentions, and it is hard work. And there's no use in like adding to the sort of misery that you were just alluding to by, not being, not trying to make it as equitable as you can, and not trying to create as much of a community as you can.
I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I think maybe even starting out, people get the idea that you must be very aggressively competitive and that we're all sharks and that's how you get ahead. And I suppose that there are people who work that way, but I've been able to avoid those people, or I've chosen to avoid them, and you end up working with the people that you like the best, and so yes, we're not all sharks. We're puppies, all of us. We're yeah.
I'm a cat person.
A cat. Well,
But same thing.
I'm glad you said that. Yeah, thanks.
Just to bounce off of what you said, today's editorial assistants are tomorrow's editors.
Yeah, that's true.
That's
So
certainly
that's
true.
actually the best advice that anyone has given. So just, if you're working with an EA or an editorial assistant, be very kind to them, because someday they're gonna,
I mean, just be kind to people who can't necessarily help you ever, because I'm nice to receptionists, just because they've got a crappy job and nobody's nice to them.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, we're running a little long, but maybe 5 minutes or so for some questions from you guys, for our panelists. Yes, sir.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm actually here on behalf of my son. He's trying to get a book published. He lives in Brooklyn, and I saw Ms. Cohen, who's living in Brooklyn.
There she is.
He's from New Orleans, but he's having trouble getting an agent. He sent us, do you have any suggestions about, it seems like you have to have an agent before you have a publisher, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any suggestions?
You certainly do.
Murder mysteries and murder mysteries?
Well, the advice that's most often given is to look at the books that he likes the most, or books that are sort of inspired or in conversation with his book, and flip to the back and see who their agents are. So you find the agents that are sort of more tailored to what you are doing, which narrows the field down tremendously, because they're already looking for the kind of work that you are producing, hopefully. So that's the first advice that I feel like people often give about agents. And then the other, speaking of the being kind, is just make as many friends as you can in the literary community and ask them about their agents, because they'll always tell you, and just having a point of contact when getting in touch with people is enormously helpful. You just say, you know, I've heard that you know so-and-so, can you look at my book? And for some reason that really helps you sort of get to the next step of being noticed. So trying to work between those two things would be the best advice I can give, and then just keep going at it, because eventually you kind of land in the right spot, hopefully.
Querytracker.com. I know it's a kind of weird to just throw out a website, but querytracker.com. They have a portion of the web. It's a free to join website, and they have a portion of the website called Who Reps Whom, and you can literally just, you know, even if so, because, you know, not everybody once they get to a certain level keeps thanking their agent in the acknowledgments. I'm shocked. But
You read acknowledgments where people don't thank their agents?
Yeah, or they don't necessarily name them as their
Right.
agent. You know, sometimes it's, oh, and thanks to Sam, I couldn't live without him, and like, you don't know who that is, right? And so, but it's a specific. It tracks who. Right. So it's a, you know, and there's a community on there that talk about, you know, what agents like, you know, and it keeps track of the agent submission requirements. Stick to those too, because some agents are like, all I want to see is a query letter. Some agents want to see the first 5 pages, and don't confuse those two, because if you send 5 pages to the not person, all that tells them is, I don't know how to read directions.
Also, follow all the literary agents you possibly can on Twitter, because they talk about what they like all the time. They do manuscript wish list, where they sort of put out specifically what they're looking for. They're calling for, you know, narrative nonfiction, or they're looking for mysteries with protagonists of color, or whatever it is, and so that can be helpful for figuring
I
that
would have
out
never
too.
thought of that. First, you have to join.